World News Today, brought to you by Continental Radio and Television Corporation, makers of Admiral Radio, America's smart set. By shortwave broadcast direct from important overseas stations, as well as leading news centers of our own country, CBS correspondents are waiting to bring you a complete report from the world's political and battlefront. But first, here's Doug Edwards.
British and Canadian troops have widened their bridgehead on the toe of the Italian mainland to a strip of land at least 40 miles wide, and great air fleets continue the systematic destruction of enemy communications. There's an unconfirmed report that the Italian fleet has abandoned the big naval base at Taranto. In Russia, the Ukrainian steel center of Stalino seems to be next on the Red Army's schedule of reconquest. And in the Pacific, American planes have all but wiped out the Jap base at Salamaua and Lae, New Guinea. Now, news direct from the Mediterranean. Admiral Radio takes you to CBS Algiers. John Daly reporting.
The British and Canadian troops of the 8th Army in the last 24 hours have tripled the length of the front they hold on the toe of Italy. Every town and every inch of coastal highway from Bagnara above the Straits of Messina to Melito, more than 30 miles to the south, is firmly in our hands. Today's official communique says the advance continues along the whole front. Bagnara fell to British commandos on Friday night less than 24 hours after 0 hour. The commandos, coming in from the sea, met with little opposition and rapidly formed a junction with the forces who had landed at San Giovanni to the south. Meanwhile, the troops who landed originally at Reggio drove down the coast road to occupy Melito under the toe with no opposition worthy of the name. In spite of increased demolition, which is causing some delay, Axis opposition remains comparatively weak. Some 2,000 prisoners have been taken, mainly Italians, who didn't fight. It is possible that the Axis forces may have pulled out of the toe. They are like a man fighting a lion out on the end of a tree limb who has to look back continuously to make sure no one is saving or sawing the limb behind him. Somewhere in the foot of Italy, it's expected that the Axis will make a stand. That somewhere will probably be a point where the constant threat of an Allied flanking movement by sea is partially neutralized by enough land space to leave a fighting chance for a quick withdrawal. In the air, there was a slight increase in Axis opposition yesterday. 20 enemy fighters carried out an ineffective attack against our supply lines in the Straits of Messina. 8 of them were shot down. Meanwhile, our tactical air force roamed all over the Italian toe looking for targets and not finding very many. The Strategic Air Force, in spite of bad weather, successfully attacked airfields, railway and road concentrations, and radio installations near Naples. One contributing factor to the lack of Axis opposition is the chaotic condition of their communications. Reconnaissance photographs taken within the last 24 hours show the Axis rail communications very seriously damaged from Bolzano in the north, only 30 miles from the Austrian border, all the way down to the tip of the Italian toe. Rail lines radiating out of Bolzano, Trento, Pisa, Cancello, Pescara, Benevento, and Aversa, all key junction points, are either cut or blocked by smashed rolling stock, tremendous craters, blasted tracks, and blown bridges. Damage to highways has also been severe. Important bridges have been blasted to rubble. This is still fundamentally a war of supply, and we have hit the Axis where it hurts most in destroying his supply line. Now back to CBS in New York.
More news in just a moment. But first, here's Warren Sweeney with a word from Admiral Radio.
Here is an example of cooperation between air and surface forces that resulted in the capture of an enemy submarine. Cooperation made possible through the use of radio. An Allied patrol bomber operating near the coast of England surprised a Nazi U-boat cruising on the surface. The sub crash dived, but was blown back above water by a series of well-placed bombs. Crippled and unable to submerge, it lay helpless while the plane, its bomb racks empty, grimly circled and kept vigilant guns trained on the conning tower. Without radio, this encounter might have ended in a stalemate, but a message from the plane brought a surface vessel to take over the U-boat to finish the work begun by a land-based bomber. Here is another dramatic instance of the use our fighting men are making of the equipment now pouring from Admiral assembly lines. These uses are many and varied, but wherever Admiral-built instruments are found, whether in the sub-zero cold of the stratosphere or the burning heat of the African desert, our men can be sure they have in their hands electronic weapons of proven dependability. And after the war, when peace has been won, the knowledge gained in building these wartime implements will be yours in the Peacetime Admiral, America's smart set. Now, here once again for Admiral Radio is Doug Edwards.
For a direct report on the latest news in Great Britain, Admiral Radio takes you now to CBS London. Larry Lasser reporting.
London is relaxed and relieved over the knowledge that the long-awaited invasion of Italy has turned out in RAF slang to be a piece of cake. The fighting is expected to get tougher as soon as the British troops come up against the German defense lines. No observers here are willing to venture a guess as to where the Germans will make a stand. But it's known that a number of German divisions are in the south of Italy. In London, it looks as though the Italians would be ready to come to terms at any time. But the Badoglio government is not the real master of the situation in Italy. Those 18-odd divisions of the German army and their supporting Luftwaffe are at the moment the strongest force on the Italian mainland. Informed quarters here believe that we will have to land at least a similar number of divisions in Italy before the Badoglio government could feel free to make a decision in our favor. There are increasingly strong rumors that the northernmost country of Fortress Europe is ready to call it quits. But the British attitude is that if Finland wants to talk peace, they'll have to approach Moscow direct. The Finnish indecision lies in the fact that Germany is feeding them. There is a possibility that if Sweden were willing to reduce the rations of the Swedes by 10%, Finland could be fed and find it possible to retire from the war. London is undoubtedly rather surprised by the news that Marshal Stalin has made a pact with the leaders of the Orthodox Church in Russia, that he has agreed to a meeting of Russian bishops to elect a patriarch of all Russia and to establish a holy synod. Observers here surmise that this Soviet move has a direct bearing on the new situation in the Balkans. The main rift between highly religious Bulgaria and Soviet Russia has always been over the Bolshevik curb on the Orthodox Church. The fact that the Red Army is now re-entering the Ukraine, where the Germans re-established the Orthodox Church during their 2-year occupation, is also reflected in the Kremlin's decision. There are people here who wonder if the timing of Stalin's friendly gestures toward religion had any connection with the Pope's recent peace appeal. I return you now to CBS in New York.
Columbia's traveling reporter Don Pryor is in New Orleans ready to interview Andrew J. Higgins, the man credited with the impossible in building PT boats, landing barges, and other craft for our armed forces. Mr. Higgins has strong views on the utilization of our vast war facilities when the fighting is over. For this interview, Admiral Radio takes you to New Orleans. Don Pryor reporting.
All over America, I have asked all kinds of men what they were planning for the peace, what they thought the chances were to utilize America's vast war facilities when the war is over. I've had all kinds of answers. They range from blank despair to a kind of hypnotic faith that all will be well. In between, there's a strong current of determined purpose that says, by golly, the job's got to be done regardless. One of the greatest spokesmen for that school is Andrew Jackson Higgins of New Orleans. He's the designer and builder of PT boats, landing barges, cargo ships, and other craft, and soon he will be one of the nation's largest builders of cargo airplanes. Mr. Higgins, what's your answer?
There is no room in the world today for the negatives, those who say it can't be done. This war will be won by the positive men, liberals, and so will the peace. We must look forward to the day when our boys will be returning. They will not be satisfied to rake leaves or sell apples on street corners, to be shunted or shoved around. They will demand jobs and decent incomes. It's up to the government and industry alike to plan, to engineer, to see to it that this country will be a better place in which to live than it was before. We have learned that when there is a need, the money to meet that need can be found. There's been too much prattling about balanced budgets, alarm for the national debt, such negative bugaboos used to maintain the status quo. In time of war, we forget them and go ahead and perform so-called miracles. Should we fear to attempt tasks for peace as great as or even greater than our accomplishments for war? Why should not the vast plants and other enterprises created to produce expendables be even increased for greater employment to create usable things to advance our civilization, to ensure the betterment of our way of life? Why should we hesitate to undertake vast enterprises, such as the creation of superhighways, super railroads, the establishment of great craft training schools, the elimination of the slums to provide decent habitations to all our people? America can do all this.
Well, for the present, Mr. Higgins, there's an immediate problem, manpower.
Yes, but I think a lot of the manpower that's been recruited away from this section will be coming back soon. Ducks fly south in the fall, you know. Aside from that, I believe people leaving non-essential jobs for war work should be given guarantees their old jobs will be secure when the war is over. The same assurance the law gives to soldiers and sailors. Moreover, I believe the government should clarify the situation now that war plants with proven capacity for economical and quality production will be utilized for peace as well as for war. If people had that assurance, they would, or should, more cheerfully give up their present job for a job in a war plant.
Well, speaking of post-war use of war plants, how about your own organization? I understand you're interested in boats, helicopters, plywood products, and lots of other things.
I'm interested in everything that will contribute to better living, better homes, better transportation, lower costs in production, and proper and insured income for the workers. There must be a greater distribution of wealth. There must be universal opportunity for all to acquire education and works training. This can't be done unless we have a national policy and a national plan that calls for these things. It will be useless for any individual to say that he's going to do any one thing or another otherwise.
That was Andrew Jackson Higgins. This is Don Pryor in New Orleans. I return you to CBS in New York and Doug Edwards.
One of the few places in Europe where both Allied and Axis diplomats and travelers come and go freely is the Spanish capital of Madrid. For a report direct from there, Admiral Radio takes you to Madrid. Glenn Stadler reporting.
The big local news in Spain today comes from Burgos, where General Franco presided at the celebration of the founding of the Kingdom of Castile 1,000 years ago. During the remainder of this week, the local headlines will concern the grand finale of the summer season in San Sebastian, where Foreign Minister Jordana, Ambassador Hayes, and the diplomatic corps have been residing. These events are chiefly social, but also have much political significance. Before going north, the Army Superior Council met twice. Such meetings are held only to consider important matters. Aside from politics, all Spain is speculating on whether or not a big-time bullfighter, Domingo Ortega, will appear in Madrid next week. And anything can happen, either inside or outside the ring. Yesterday, bullfight fans carried to the cemetery the body of one of their fallen heroes. Spaniards, of course, are vitally interested in Italy, but consider its collapse a foregone conclusion. One observer commented that it merely was a question of whether Italy would be devoured bit by bit, like eating an artichoke or swallowed in one mouthful. They would not be surprised if a definite offer of peace came from the Council of Ministers in Rome tomorrow. Some think the Allies will drive across Italy, span the Adriatic, and join General Mikhailovich in Yugoslavia and the thousands of patriots in Albania and Greece. Because of this, much importance is attached to the Hungarian Foreign Minister's pessimistic statement yesterday. He said that Hungary only entered the war to defend herself, yet he grabbed part of Yugoslavia, and her troops are fighting and retreating in Russia. It's quite possible that the Hungarians, with whom the war was never popular, are exploring ways and means of extricating themselves from Nazi domination. From France comes the story that Maurice Chevalier has started a new mode in men's clothing, the turned-up pants leg. It has had widespread success, for it has become the symbol of those who don't want to be sent to work in Germany. This is Glenn Stadler in Madrid, returning you to Doug Edwards in New York.
One of the most important phases of America's war effort is the safe and speedy transportation of American soldiers wherever they're needed, whenever they are needed. To give you a picture of how that gigantic job is being handled on America's railroads, Admiral Radio takes you to the Pullman Company's headquarters in Chicago. Bill Slocum, Jr. reporting.
I'm sitting now in a simple office located in the Pullman Company's Chicago headquarters. Across from me sits an affable-looking gent who claims he's 71 years old. He's got a cigar perched jauntily in the corner of his mouth, and without ever losing a drop of ashes, he sees to it that the tremendous and important demands of the Army Transportation Corps and the Navy are met promptly. His name is Bert Dewey, and of course they call him Admiral. Admiral, tell us how your job works.
That phone rings over there, and the Army or Navy tell me to get so many Pullman cars at such and such a place at a certain time. I do it.
You must know where every Pullman in the country is located at all times.
I do, including the ones in Mexico and Canada.
How long have you been at this sort of work, Admiral?
This is my third war, son. I've sent the boys off to 2 and brought them back after they'd won. And I don't expect to ruin my record with this war.
Is this a tough one on transportation?
The last one was a shuttle service compared to this one. I knew this was going to be a corker the day of Pearl Harbor. The Navy wanted 178 fully equipped sleeping cars at the Great Lakes Naval Training Station within 16 hours.
Did they get them?
Of course they got them.
If tonight is a typical night, how many soldiers, sailors, Marines, and Coast Guardsmen will you move?
30,000, maybe more, maybe less, but that's typical. You see, they really train the boys for this war. We figure each man makes 7 or 8 trips before he leaves the country. The boys get special training in the mountains, the desert, and in schools. In the last war, they gave them a gun and sent them across.
Supposing that phone rang right now with orders to move 500 officers and 3,500 men to Camp Forrest in Tennessee, from Camp Forrest in Tennessee to Camp Hahn in California, what would you do?
First, I'd check to see what equipment we had going into the Tennessee Territory and what was there. I'd contact our representatives in that area and order the number of cars required started to Camp Forrest, fully equipped and staffed.
You get many rush orders in your department?
Every day. We are apt to have our schedule all set when a must order comes in. That means we must stop everything we are doing and take care of the new order. Perhaps we learn a trainload of wounded men are on the East Coast waiting to be moved. Injured are always given the right-of-way over all others, so we change our plans immediately and move them.
I don't quite understand why so many Pullman cars are being used. Most of the troop movements I've seen have been in coaches.
They were going on short trips. Actually, 66% of all troops travel in sleeping cars. The Army and Navy insist upon Pullman cars for long hauls.
How many Pullmans does that mean daily?
Around 3,000 cars, and that requires a trained staff from coast to coast.
And one more thing, Admiral. It has nothing to do with the job. But could I look at the man who thinks up names for Pullman cars?
Sorry, Mr. Slocum. He works in a dark room and nobody can bother him. Seriously, though, there is a reason for every name. A mountain car is an observation car with 10 sections. A lake car has 10 sections, one drawing room and 2 compartments, and so on.
Thanks, Bert Dewey, Superintendent of Car Service for the Pullman Company. Thanks for telling us how Pullman cars are named, and thanks for your magnificent contributions to winning this, our third war. I return you now to CBS in New York and Doug Edwards.
Here in our New York studios to discuss the continuing Russian summer offensive is Columbia's military analyst, Major George Fielding Elliott.
The Germans are accelerating the pace of their withdrawal from the Donetsk Basin, where the Russians have now occupied about half of the important junctions in the rail network centering about the German stronghold of Stalino. The Russians are approaching Stalino from 3 directions, north, northeast, and east. And the further threat to the city is the possibility of its being outflanked from the south by a Russian column which is making some progress along the shore of the Sea of Azov. This German withdrawal is the result of the Russian successes farther north, whose extension toward the Dnieper would inevitably mean the capture or destruction of such troops as might still be in the Donetsk when the Russians reach the Dnieper. The real strategic key to the whole southern front is the area between Kharkov and Poltava, where the Russians are keeping up strong pressure on the German defense lines while also endeavoring to outflank Poltava by a wide sweep to the westward which has almost reached the River Desna. What is really impressive is the way in which the Russians keep on finding reserves for the extension of their operations in this fashion, and also to keep up the steady pressure on the Germans farther north in the Bryansk and Smolensk areas, which prevents the Germans from withdrawing troops from north to south to meet the increasingly critical situation. Frontline dispatches suggest that previous reports of the deteriorating quality of the German Army's personnel are well-founded. Men of all ages and of various racial origins are to be found in the ranks of the Wehrmacht, which only a year or so ago was almost altogether composed of young men of German birth. This is the German situation as the German armies in South Russia stand faced with the possibility of a disaster before which even that of Stalingrad would seem small. The plain fact is, as Bill Downs, the CBS correspondent in Russia, points out, the Germans have been heavily defeated in Russia this summer, and they are going to have a tough time to get away with no more than the loss of territory. A Russian breakthrough anywhere between Poltava and Izium would mean disaster.
Now, Admiral Radio takes you to CBS Washington. Robert Lewis reporting.
The continued absence of news concerning the whereabouts of American ground forces in the current operations against Italy seems to be causing little concern here in Washington. Rather, plans are going ahead for the eventual occupation of that country, suggesting that there's more in the immediate future than meets the eye. It's been reported that a three-power committee composed of British, American, and Russian representatives has been set up to minister the entire Mediterranean area. At the same time, the State Department has appointed C.B. Baldwin, currently the chief of the Farm Security Administration, as the director of American relief and other economic operations in Italy when that country is liberated. In addition, there's another report that the three great allied powers have agreed to a conference among their foreign ministers or their representatives, which presumably would deal with political aspects of the European war. Rubber Director Jeffers' resignation, announced last night by the White House, is not taken in the same vein as other recent resignations here in Washington. Jeffers' work, as he pointed out in his letter to the President, is practically finished, and while he's been party to several intra-administration fights, there's no feeling that he resigned in a huff. President Roosevelt and other high-ranking administration leaders, in observance of the Labor Day holiday, have called for increased production from workers, management, and the nation's farmers. And while praising past performances, they said that increased output now would save more lives and suffering and bring the day of final victory even closer. Meanwhile, a government move is underway to ease the critical manpower shortages in both the railroad and aircraft industries. West Coast aircraft factories are facing a program which calls for the allocation of manpower, and the railroads have been asked to use war prisoners and suspend some of their peacetime practices to ease their manpower shortages. I return you now to CBS New York and Doug Edwards.
Once again, here is Warren Sweeney with a message from our sponsor.
Last week on this Admiral program, you had a striking illustration of one of the roles radio is playing in this war. From the flight deck of the aircraft carrier Wolverine on Lake Michigan, you saw at first hand what it means to be a naval pilot, to land a plane on the pitching deck of a ship. You heard the bump of the wheels as they struck the flight deck, the roar of the engines as the plane took off again, the terse commands of the flight officer, and the immediate response of the plane high overhead. Communication as simple and direct as if the two men were standing side by side. This authentic drama, brought to you by Admiral Radio, is being reenacted in deadly earnest in battle actions all over the world. And wherever our men are fighting, from the storm-swept Aleutians to the jungles of the Solomons, there also will you find Admiral-built equipment helping to bring closer the day of victory. When that day comes, Admiral, in peacetime the world's largest manufacturer of radio phonograph combinations with automatic record changers, will again bring you America's Smart Set.
Attention, men and women of Chicago. Your country needs you. Help build vital communication equipment for our frontline fighters at the great Admiral plants in Chicago. The work is easy and interesting. No experience is necessary, and you'll be paid while learning. The factories are modern, with the latest type machinery as well as company cafeterias for your convenience. Simply go to the employment office of the Admiral plant at 4150 North Knox Avenue by taking a Montrose streetcar to 4600 West. Or take the Armitage Avenue car to the Admiral plant at 3815 Armitage. Get into radio now, the modern business with a great future. Be sure to listen again next Sunday when Continental Radio and Television Corporation brings you World News Today, direct from the leading news centers of the world. This is the Columbia Broadcasting System. The WWII America Theater, Wrigley Building, Chicago.
World News Today, brought to you by Continental Radio and Television Corporation, makers of Admiral Radio, America's smart set. By shortwave broadcast, direct from important overseas stations, as well as leading news centers of our own country, CBS correspondents are waiting to bring you a complete report from the world's political and battlefront. But first, here's Doug Edwards.
German troops are evacuating the Mediterranean island of Sardinia while the fighting on the Italian mainland continues to go well for the American Fifth Army. Prime Minister Churchill has returned to Great Britain. American Ambassador Stanley has suddenly left Moscow and is en route to Washington for consultations. On the Russian fighting front, the Red Army continues to make tremendous gains. They're 30 miles from Smolensk, and they've recaptured Krasnograd. And in the Pacific, American forces have carried out a heavy attack on Jap targets in the Gilbert Islands. Now, for our first news direct from overseas, Admiral Radio takes you to CBS Algiers. Winston Burdett reporting.
The Fifth Army continues to make steady progress on the whole of the Salerno Gulf front. The Allied offensive, which started last Thursday morning, has driven a broad salient in the central sector and bent the German lines back to a point 12 miles inland in the south. German resistance is officially said to be weakening down on that southern flank, which is just as one would expect, as it is there that the Fifth and Eighth Armies meet. Today, the main force of the Eighth Army is piling up the coast road to join the Fifth in one solid front. The three Allied armies are closing in, straightening and shortening their line across the breadth of Italy. From the Taranto area and from Bari on the east coast, there is nothing to report, but we expect to have good news from that sector very soon. In the days to come, as our forces drive against the German Salerno positions from the south and east, and as reinforcements for the Fifth Army keep pouring in increasing numbers, our first large-scale land offensive should really begin to roll. There'll be a considerable German force against us, backed by huge supply dumps throughout the Naples area. What we have met on the Salerno beachhead is just the beginning. One significant development in the past 2 days is that the enemy has begun digging in and building fixed machine gun posts at many points. He may be preparing to abandon his recent mobile tactics and try a more static kind of defense. He may be preparing to withdraw the main body of his forces from the Salerno area, leaving an artillery stream to hold us in check. Already he has begun to thin out, and there have been no reports of German counterattacks over the weekend. The Luftwaffe also has been showing less and less fight over the Salerno battlefront. Yesterday, while our bombers and fighters were wrecking scores of German aircraft on the ground, the Luftwaffe had practically vanished from southern Italy. We still have no further details about fighting in Sardinia. 2 Italian divisions are credited with chasing the Germans off the island to further trouble in Corsica. The Germans had very few troops in Sardinia apart from air troops, and even these have been singularly inactive recently. Every day for the past month, our patrols have been ranging up and down the Sardinian coast, trying to scare up a dogfight, looking for trouble, and finding none. The place has been dead. Just now, Sardinia will probably not be of very great use to us, and its fall will have no great effect on the course of the Italian campaign. True, its 4 large airfields are only 300 miles from the land, which theoretically is as good as having an airfield just outside Rome. But our long-range bombers can operate even more effectively from better developed bases on the Italian mainland. I return you now to CBS in New York.
More news in just a moment, but first here's Warren Sweeney with a word from Admiral Radio.
There's a story that's being told of 2 student flyers, how they became battle-tested veterans the hard way. It's a typical story in which radio equipment, admiral equipment perhaps, plays an important part. 2 young pilots were getting their final instruction in Africa, the finishing touches before being sent into actual combat. While on a routine training flight, over the radio came the sudden, sharp warning, Enemy bomber at 6 o'clock. For a moment, both boys calmly assumed that the instructor was indulging in a bit of leg pulling. But looking down, they saw a huge Nazi bomber streaking in just over the water. Jolted into action by an eyeful of the real thing, they whirled their planes into a screaming dive. A press of a button, and 3 cannon shells ripped into the enemy ship. For a split second, nothing happened. Then a terrific explosion, and all that remained of the enemy bomber was a shattered tail assembly slowly sinking into the sea. On many battlefronts in such real-life dramas, Admiral-built equipment is playing a leading role. Admiral research engineers fully appreciate their responsibility to our fighting men, are devoting all their skill and ingenuity to building rugged, dependable instruments of communication. And after the war, when Admiral can again return to civilian production, the knowledge gained now will be yours in the peacetime, Admiral, America's smart set. Now, here once again is Doug Edwards.
In Western Europe, Allied planes are again hammering the continent, and Prime Minister Churchill has returned home after his conferences in this country. Now, Admiral Radio takes you to CBS London, Charles Collingwood reporting.
Winston Churchill is back home. The British Prime Minister has returned to help open the new session of Parliament. He will find the legislators in a mood both admiring and questioning. They, like the people for whom they speak, want to know from Mr. Churchill, first of all, about Italy, not about the progress of the 5th and 8th Armies. The British have no trouble reading communiques. What they want to know is what happened between the fall of Mussolini and the invasion of Italy. The general opinion is that we missed a chance. Not since North Africa has there been such a unanimous querying of official policy. I don't want to give you a lot of quotations. Doubtless American papers are saying much the same things. But on the left in Britain, it is being said that we delayed in Italy because we are afraid of unleashing the forces of Italian radical democracy. On the right, they are saying that we just delayed. But from right to left, they think something went wrong. When Winston Churchill gets through with the international situation, he's going to find himself confronted here for the first time with a serious situation on the home front. Up till now, Britain's home front problems have been easily handled by economists and administrators. The government produced a plan, and the people carried it out. No one really noticed, as we do in America, the separation between internal problems and war problems. But now there is beginning to be trouble on the industrial front. The strike rate is going up. There are grumblings on all sides over the operation of Britain's wartime labor policy. Employers say that there is no longer any discipline now that their power to hire and fire is gone. Workers complain about the fixing of their wages, about being arbitrarily transferred to lower paid and less attractive work. And they say that they've lost their last weapon when their right to strike is denied. This situation is most dramatic in the coal fields, where last week more than 30,000 miners were out on strike. Britain's coal output continues to drop. They can't get new men to go down into the mines by just asking them. And miners strike when the government tries to compel boys to take up coal mining. It's a difficult position. As Britain goes into the 5th winter of the war, it is coal and not food which has become the greatest home problem. I return you now to New York.
Allied planes from the Middle East have again attacked Italy, and there are new reports of impending action in the Balkans by Allied forces. For a direct report from this war zone, Admiral Radio takes you to CBS Cairo. James Fleming reporting.
Today's Middle East air communiques tell of intense bomber and fighter activity during the last 48 hours. In an air battle over the eastern Mediterranean yesterday, fighter planes of the Royal Air Force encountered formations of German bomber and fighter aircraft. When the scrap was over, the RAF fighters had sent 5 Junkers 88 bombers and 2 Messerschmitt 109 fighters to their destruction. Last night, Wellington bombers were over the largest island of the Dodecanese group, Rhodes. Here they attacked the important enemy-held airdrome of Maritza, starting a fire among the buildings on the field. Friday night, Liberator and Halifax bombers attacked Foggia in eastern Italy.
The RAF reports 3 aircraft missing from these and other operations. By daylight Saturday, heavy liberators of the 9th U.S. Air Force struck out against Pasquale, the important communications center in eastern Italy. Once again, the target was the railway yard, a vital part of Germany's transport system within Italy. Dropping over 70 tons of high explosives, the liberators blanketed the yards with bursts. A number of the explosions were followed by heavy black smoke fires. All aircraft returned safely from this operation. War can be wacky at times. There's the case of the flying parrot. Here in Cairo, there's a young flight lieutenant who has as an inseparable companion a gaily plumed parrot that he carries about perched on his shoulder. It's a moody, silent bird, this parrot, not given to careless chatter, and probably for good reason. For rumor has it that he's accompanied his master on more than one hazardous mission. Here, then, is a priceless opportunity for some enterprising publisher. If he can sign up this bird, he's got a story. Then there was that mechanic in the RAF from South Africa, a lad named Tailspin Carter. The other day, in a display of epic bad judgment, he somehow got astride the tail of a Spitfire just as it was taking off. For some 9.5 minutes, he hung on for dear life. The pilot, noticing that his aircraft was behaving strangely, took a look through his rearview mirror. For a moment, he thought he'd acquired a giant gremlin. Then he recognized the hitchhiker, banked his machine so the weight of his passenger was taken by the rudder, and made a perfect 3-point landing. Tailspin Carter was okay, though a little windblown and plenty scared. This is James Fleming in Cairo. I now return you to New York.
For a discussion of the situation on the Russian battlefield, here is Columbia's military analyst, Major George Fielding Elliott.
The collapse of German resistance at the key fortress of Bryansk appears to have weakened the defensive structure of the whole German front in central Russia. Very rapid Russian advances, both northwest and southwest of Bryansk, have followed. And now a new drive, aimed directly at Smolensk, has opened with the capture, just announced by Premier Stalin in a special order of the day, of the towns of Duklovshchina and Yartsevo, approximately 30 miles northeast of Smolensk. This constitutes a double threat to Smolensk, direct pressure by the new advance and the danger that Roslavl, bastion of Smolensk on the south, may be taken by the Russians pushing out from fallen Bryansk. Farther south, the Russians yesterday reported the capture of Pavlograd, and today that of Krasnograd. These are 2 of the most important of the group of railway junctions just east of the great bend of the Dnieper River. Also yesterday, the Russians cut the Kiev-Poltava Railway at Mirgorod. This latter Russian gain leaves all of the forces east of Mirgorod, that is, all the German troops east of the Dnieper River all the way down to the Sea of Azov, dependent entirely on the bridges over the Dnieper for supply and reinforcement or for withdrawal. The German lines in this area now roughly parallel the curving course of the great river and are from 25 to 40 miles distant from it. Towards the river bridges, the Germans seem to be retiring along their whole front, and there seems a likelihood that the Russians will cut off and capture considerable numbers of these retreating Germans. This likelihood is increased by the Russian capture of the German belaying force at Pryluki, which has been surrounded for the last 2 or 3 days, but has been holding out strongly so far. One important strategic result which the Russians may gain in the south is the retaking of the Crimea, from which the Romanian oil fields could be bombed at a range of something like 300 miles. The Russians are now only about 35 miles from the one remaining railway which serves the German garrison of the Crimea. And the retaking of Novorossiysk has given the Russian Black Sea Fleet a good harbor and thus afforded them considerably increased freedom of action. This may permit of the launching of amphibious operations against the German forces in the Crimea, such as those by which the Russians last winter recovered the port of Kerch and Theodosia and for a time threatened to surround and destroy the German besiegers of Sevastopol. It must also be remembered that the recovery of the Crimea by the Russians would have very considerable effects both in the Balkans and in Turkey, already greatly disturbed from the Axis viewpoint by the surrender of Italy.
That was Major George Fielding Elliott. American forces have carried out a new heavy attack on Jap Islands in the Central Pacific. For details and an indication of what kind of fighting the Navy is looking forward to, Admiral Radio takes you to CBS Honolulu, Webley Edwards reporting.
The Pacific Fleet carried out its obvious intention of hitting the Japs regularly and in strength by attacking in the Gilbert Island group Saturday night and Sunday, East Longitude time. A communique released late last night by Admiral Chester W. Nimitz here at Pearl Harbor said that strong Pacific Ocean area forces conducted heavy raids on the Jap bases at Tarawa Island in the northern Gilbert group and on Nauru Island west of the Gilbert. These operations were carried out according to plan during the night preceding and for a good portion of the day of September 19th, East Longitude time. Details of the operation are not immediately available. With the war in the Pacific into its 21st month, the United States Navy has given strong indication that it expects no quick or easy victory. Two items point this up. Another new dry dock for repair of warships has just been completed at Pearl Harbor and will be dedicated this week. The Navy is increasing its hospital facilities here in Hawaii to meet an increase of wounded as the war mounts in tempo. There's every indication that the Pacific Fleet is preparing to strike at the Japs regularly and in strength. The fleet is ready and able to do this at any point from the far north all the way to the East Indies, perhaps in more than one place in quick 1-2 blows. The bulk of the Navy is in the Pacific, stronger than at any time in the nation's history. The surrender of the Italian fleet releases British sea strength from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean, thus further stretching the already wide coverage of the now defense-minded Jap fleet. This factor undoubtedly has played an important part in the plans of strategy mapped out by Admiral Nimitz and his staff for the coming fall. The United States Navy now dominates better than 3/4 of the Pacific Ocean area. That portion controlled by the Japs, however, contains the greater portion of the Pacific Islands. These, as has often been pointed out, are stationary aircraft carriers. Since the turn of the tide, our forces have obtained some of these stationary carriers, the Solomons, the Aleutians, and in our newly won portions of New Guinea. Ours, however, is still the long haul. I have seen a considerable portion of the Pacific Fleet's might in and out of Pearl Harbor, and it is of comforting size and strength. These warships are not out here for defense purposes. That our fleet can and will attack is shown by the recent Marcus Island offensive, less than 1,000 miles from Japan, and this week's attack on the Gilbert. It's reasonable to expect more such attacks from now on and regularly. This is Webley Edwards in Honolulu. I return you now to New York.
Here in our New York studio is Larry Meyer, war correspondent who has just returned from the Southwest Pacific area, where he broadcasts for CBS World News. He was right on the scene when our troops landed on Nassau Beach in their drive against Talamawa and Lae. And he left the war zone only 2 weeks ago when American and Australian forces were entering the final stages of their successful offensive against the Jap strongholds. What's the situation there now, Larry?
After 2 years of struggle in the Pacific, the picture at last is beginning to look more favorable. That is true, especially in the air. Actually, land operations in the Salamaua-Lae area have been on a minor scale, although we really have been doing a mighty splendid job with the equipment we have. But really big land drives are still impossible because we have not yet sent sufficient men and material out there.
And how did we win at Talamaua and Lae?
Our successes were due to the skill of our soldiers, our superior equipment, our air coverage, and most of all, the element of surprise. Our troops have proved themselves better fighting men than the Japs. And in actual combat, in the muck of the rotting jungle, they have blasted the myth of Japanese superiority in warfare in the tropical wilderness. And when they went after Salamaua and Lae, they sprang a double-barrel surprise. First, we landed troops at Nassau Bay and started thrusting toward Salamaua. While the Japs were concentrating on the defense of that base, we sent out another surprise force on the other side and outflanked them in the Lae sector.
Then it was fairly easy going?
Not a bit. I can tell you it was no picnic. I've been over that ground on bombing missions. I've hiked through the jungles and mountains with the troops and swung around Huon Gulf on barges and patrol torpedo boats. The natural obstacles are heartbreaking, and the Japs resisted bitterly. Yet we succeeded in opening a new phase of war, offensive war, in the Southwest Pacific.
Are there any other factors in our success?
Yes, superiority in the air. General MacArthur, in a recent talk I had with him, confirmed our superiority. We have scored great blows at WWII, Madang, and other enemy bases. Besides, we are getting more and more fighter and bomber planes out there. But probably the most important element is the plain fact that our flyers themselves are vastly superior to the jets. The score in our favor now is nearly 10-1.
Well, Larry, we seem to be doing all right so far. How about future operations?
Well, General MacArthur has never become fully reconciled to the idea of winning the war in Europe first. Naturally, he has to fit in his policies with the world strategy of the Allied High Command. But he can use the men and equipment he has to their utmost advantage. And even with his limited resources, he hits the Japs where he can and whenever he can.
Where do you think the next blow will fall?
Many observers look for a land, sea, and air assault on the Japanese naval base at Rabaul. Yet the first really big blow may come at some far distant point least suspected by the Japs.
That was Larry Meyer, one of Columbia's correspondents in the Southwest Pacific. In this country, Ambassador Stanley's return home from Moscow and a new discussion on the future of General Marshall are attracting major attention. For details, Admiral Radio takes you to CBS Washington, Robert Lewis reporting.
The departure from Moscow of American Ambassador Stanley is expected to further the arrangements for the three-party meeting of American, British, and Russian representatives in the near future. The State Department yesterday had announced that Stanley was returning for the purpose of making a personal report to Secretary Hull and President Roosevelt. And although there is speculation in some quarters that Stanley's return is the answer to the sudden recall of the Russian ambassador from Washington last month, it's generally considered here that that is not the reason for this new move. However, it's not known whether Stanley will return to Moscow, but if he doesn't, it's felt that the reasons will be personal and not political. Those recurring rumors, both here and in London, that General Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, would soon be appointed to the post of Allied Commander-in-Chief in Europe, has drawn the fire of the Army and Navy Journal, the semi-official magazine of the services. In an editorial, the journal scoffed at reports that such an appointment would be a promotion, saying that powerful interests would like to see Marshall removed from his present position and a man more sympathetic to their interests appointed. And other opinion here in Washington closely follows that of the journal. Marshall is considered top. On the home front, there are rumors that Prentice Brown is about to resign as chief of the OPA, but these reports are strictly rumors and based principally on Brown's long absence from his desk here in Washington. In Congress, final consideration of the Wheeler bill to defer the drafting of fathers may be postponed from Tuesday to some day later in the week, due to the inability to get recent testimony printed in time. But regardless of this delay, it's really predicted here that the senators will not pass the bill. Over in the House, Representative Joseph Martin, the Republican leader, says that if the Senate does reject the Wheeler bill, it will remove any necessity for House consideration. But regardless of the fate of the bill, Martin says that he plans to start action soon to increase the allowances granted to soldiers' dependents by 20%. And now back to CBS, New York.
Premier Stalin, in the third order of the day, has just announced that Soviet troops have captured the junction of Lubny on the Poltava-Kiev Railroad. And now here's Warren Sweeney.
You've heard many stories of IPOD radio. Much of it Admiral-built equipment is staying on our battlefields. But what are the training programs of our troops here at home? An interesting plan for furthering the use of radio in this important work was recently revealed. Manning an anti-aircraft battery, for example, is a highly technical precision operation. Naturally, the more realistic the target, the more skilled the men will be when faced with actual battle conditions. Kites have been used, as well as sleeves towed by training planes. Miniature gliders have also been released high in the air to serve as objects for anti-aircraft fire. Experiments are now being made with model planes driven by actual motors and entirely guided and controlled by radio. New instruments, improvements on the old, new applications of radio and electronics. These are the problems that have become a constant challenge to admiral engineers and research technicians. Not until after the war will we fully appreciate the changes, present improvements, and new developments will make in our daily lives. Even now, Admiral is making long-range plans for conversion to peacetime production. and many wartime advances have already been assigned important roles in the new Admiral America's Smart Set. Women of America, with the manpower needs of our country expanding daily, there is an urgent necessity for workers in the war-supporting industries that will keep our war workers healthy, well-fed, and well-clothed. Experience is not necessary. Even though you've never worked at a job, there is a place for you now in the service of your country. The job may not be glamorous. It may be clerking in a grocery store or taking care of a neighbor's children. But if by so doing you can release one skilled worker to fill one vacant place in a war plant, you will bring the day of victory a little closer. Join us next week at this same time. This is the Columbia Broadcasting System.
The WBBM Air Theater, regularly in Chicago.